Liar. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Thursday, December 17th, 2020. Time for yet another show. Thursday show. An unusual Thursday show. Well, not an unusual winter Thursday show. Greg Dworkin, all the way up in snowy Connecticut, finds himself with, well, luckily plenty of power thanks to the whole house generator. Always a smart move, but it doesn't restore internet connections. And, you know, the not Wi-Fi, but rather cell phone connection, probably not robust enough to make things work today. And some windy weather on top of it all. So, well, you know, that's just kind of the way it is these days. And it's not like we're at a loss for stories, certainly. It's the wild and woolly last weeks of the Trump administration. And, of course, we could tell you stories from the first 4 years of the Trump administration. That would probably suffice for 4 years worth of, 4 years worth of shows, certainly. But 2 hours, to be sure, we can fill this way. So good luck to Greg in digging out from underneath the storm. I don't know what the snow was like, but a lot of you got a significant accumulation. We didn't get socked with it the way people were worried about around here earlier in the week, but that's kind of the story of the way winter storms go around here. I forgot the cardinal rule of take whatever they're predicting when they get really excited about it and divide that number by 3, and that's the accumulation you'll finally end up with on the ground in most cases. They fooled me this time. Somebody put out a very clever, but I guess it didn't turn out to be very clever, weather map, an interesting look at accumulation predictions. This time with a probability, coloring in regions of a map with a probability that by their prediction, you would, in these areas, end up with more snow than they were actually predicting. And I think they put our little county here in the 50 to 80% range, which was a little unusual, since I think they were looking at something like, I don't know, I think originally they were saying, well, you were in the way of that one snow band that could leave 7 to 14 inches of snow on the ground, and you got a 50 to 80% chance of getting even more than that. But that was early, and the models changed, and things shifted, and it began to look more and more like we would end up on the periphery of the thing, and we did. It's cold, it's icy, the snow that fell is still there because it's covered in a crust of ice, but I don't know. I don't know how things are where you are. Hopefully you're warm and dry. That would be good news. It was kind of messy out there. I did have a dentist appointment I had to get to. Not far away, but it was treacherous driving. The Christmas tree still stands. That's good news. It's tied to the curtain rods. I hope it doesn't pull them out of the wall. But, bad news for the tree, apparently. Having tipped over at some point in the middle of the night and been dry on the bottom for who knows how long. Apparently the science says the sap will close up the bottom and it won't draw any water out of the tree stand now, and it'll just get dry, and I don't know what. That's the life of the Christmas tree anyway, so, at some point it just dries out. I think it smells pretty good when it gets dry anyway. So, whatever. It'll dry out a little early this year. What else could we do to make 2020 a real drag, right? All right. Well, we could take a look back at what has happened in 2020 and the stories that is generating this morning. I have to, I guess we can go back to the story we were discussing yesterday. What the hell was it? Oh, yes, it was what was it centered around? It was centered around the investigation. Let me see if I can jump back to our pocket from yesterday. Why can't I find that easily? I would have archived it by now. But yes, we were reading the stories from the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. The Crew press releases. We read 2, and specifically one was astonishing, true, that the DOJ was rushing out a no-bid contract for lethal injection drugs so that the Trump administration could execute a few more people before it left office. And then, by the way, gave out a flurry of pardons to anybody who did enough begging. That, too, on the DOJ front. Didn't get a chance to mention yesterday that apparently Julian Assange, Trump says, is in line for one of those pardons. Because, of course, we love WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, we love you. And never mind that, there's apparently a serious case to be made against Julian Assange. But whatever. It's been a long, weird legal saga. He was heading to some sort of extraordinary conclusion one way or another. But story we can share later on when we get back to the pardons issue. Apparently, things are going crazy in the DOJ and in the White House and in the personal office of the president, because that's how you get pardons these days. You don't go through the pardon attorneys anymore. That office was set up to try and avoid this kind of craziness and confusion. But what the hell? Just another norm. Let's get rid of it. But apparently everybody realizes, oh my gosh, we could probably beg or bribe our way into a pardon very quickly if we act soon. And apparently anybody who works anywhere near the president has a phone ringing off the hook with people trying to figure out how can I get my pardon request in front of the president. Anyway, somebody else will need to put a pardon request in front of the president. Apparently, Michael Caputo. So yes, we read the story from Crew that they were registering a complaint on CDC records destruction. And what we read yesterday was this release from them saying, I guess they were targeting Robert Redfield with this at the moment. This scandal has sort of moved to his venue. Not that he wasn't in trouble anyway, but to refresh your memory, CDC and its director, Robert Redfield, appear to have violated the Federal Records Act by instructing a CDC employee to destroy an email showing political interference by Trump administration appointees in scientific reports about the coronavirus, according to a letter sent today by Crew to the National Archives. And in response to the apparent violation, Crew urged the archives to take immediate action to ensure CDC's compliance with the FRA. This, in other words, along with letters from Jim Clyburn to Redfield, is the sternly worded letter response to what at bottom is, I don't know what to tell you, an enormous scandal of historic proportions. It's not just, of course, about this email. This is sort of a peripheral issue to this. We read through this complaint and release yesterday, and we're astonished to find, boy, that sounds like Michael Caputo that they're talking about, directing all sorts of, well, in this case, interference with, what was it, the mortality and morbidity weekly reports, or do I have it backwards? Is it morbidity and mortality weekly reports? I don't know. I'm not in the healthcare line, so I can't recall exactly which one it's supposed to be, but I think we actually read the actual complaint, and it outlined it for us. But at any rate, that was just one part of what Michael Caputo was up to while he was at HHS. So I looked around yesterday after the show because I thought I promised everybody I would check into whether or not this was in fact Michael Caputo's doing, that this was in fact Michael Caputo we were talking about. And I did find something yesterday. I was kind of astonished that all the stories sort of left that stuff out yesterday, and didn't really mention Caputo and what was going on with Caputo. Let me move this CDC complaint story back out of the Pocket Archive so that we can include it in the roundup today. So let's see, where did I mark this thing? I know I pocketed something about, there we are. I grabbed an old Washington Post story just to verify that it was in fact Caputo that we were talking about. This is a Washington Post piece from September. Ancient, right? Trump official seeks greater control over CDC reports on coronavirus. And this is an after-the-fact report on Caputo. I think Caputo was already out of there by that point. But let me read this, and then we'll discuss why Caputo was out of there. Political appointees at the Department of Health and Human Services have sought to change, delay, and prevent the release of reports about the coronavirus by the CDC because they were viewed as undermining President Trump's message that the pandemic is under control, which of course it was not. But it was his message, so there you go. Michael Caputo, the top HHS spokesman, said in an interview Saturday that he and one of his advisors have been seeking greater scrutiny of the CDC's weekly scientific dispatches, known as the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, for the past 3.5 months. I bring this up again. We absolutely discussed this story, and in light of what Greg was telling us yesterday about, he was lamenting the true cost of the loss of the CDC as a leader in scientific integrity and in its mission to bring a nonpartisan exercise of medical and scientific knowledge on behalf of the country, but also on behalf of the world. When you're talking about global pandemics, America's response is extraordinarily important, even if Americans aren't, by and large, in danger of becoming infected by this disease. The world looks to Americans to lead response to things like this, both because we have the medical knowledge and technology, and we're ordinarily a stable democracy that's capable of providing guidance and aid no matter where the outbreak takes place. And if it takes place in the United States, well, it has worldwide global economic impact to worry about. And I guess if you let that languish, well, you can tank the world economy, if not just the American economy. Anyway, so I guess it didn't really matter who you put in charge of taking care of the coronavirus, right? After all, the president isn't personally important in all of this. It's who he puts in place to implement policy that really makes a difference. The deep state, if you will take care of these things. Anyway, so anyhow, where were we? This was, I guess am I misjudging the timeline of Caputo's exit? I maybe should look that up as well, because in this piece from September, he's kind of like, well, he's the spokesman and says that he and one of his advisors were seeking this scrutiny, and then this sort of seeks to refocus this on the advisor, Paul Alexander. The advisor, Paul Alexander, has sent repeated emails to the CDC seeking changes and demanding that the reports be halted until he could make edits. I guess at worst, you could say, well, okay, so Paul Alexander isn't actually in the structure here. He's Caputo's guru, who's advising him to do this stuff, and Caputo himself, the guy on the scene, wrecking HHS and CDC from the inside. The emails, first reported late Friday, remember this is from September, this article, late Friday by Politico, described the CDC documents, widely known as the MMWR, as being hit pieces on the administration. I mean, they're straight science, and always have been, and that's been their value in America and around the world for however long they've been publishing this thing. But to Michael Caputo, they've been converted into hit pieces on the administration. Caputo confirmed the authenticity of the emails. He was still there to do that at this time. The emails echo the sentiments from an earlier attack by Alexander, reported in the Washington Post in July, about an MMWR on the potential risk of the coronavirus to pregnant women. In that email, Alexander also accused the CDC of undermining the president. The emails are the latest evidence of how the nation's top public health agency is coming under intense pressure from Trump and his allies, who are playing down the dangers of the pandemic ahead of the November 3rd presidential election. Most often, the MMWRs are issued for purely scientific reasons, Caputo said on Saturday. But in an election year and in a time of COVID-19, which just happens to coincide, it's no longer unanimously scientific. There's political content. Caputo said his conclusions are based on reviews by Alexander, who is an assistant professor at McMaster University in Canada and a specialist in health research methods. Caputo hired him this spring to advise on the science of the pandemic, because there were no American scientists who could possibly have done this, of course. The real reason being Caputo needed somebody who would back up his position. And after a long search throughout America, could find no one, and said, the internet tells me there's a guy who says this. Where is he? Oh, McMaster University in Canada. You know, I'm not opposed to hiring people from Canadian universities, but it's interesting that they couldn't find anyone in America who would say this, but I'm sure there was someone, but he just didn't know that guy well enough, and maybe he was somehow cronied up with Alexander here, but maybe not. Anyway, despite the changes to the MMWRs sought by HHS, a lot of alphabet soup here, the requests were, quote, infrequently accepted by the CDC, Caputo said, and then, of course, he began trying to weed people out of the CDC, get out of my way, later on. Alexander gets into productive discussions with the scientists who are open to criticism. They're free to reject them, Caputo said. Remember, this is his furious spin before his exit from government. He added, science is disagreements. It must be difficult for the CDC to be criticized by an Oxford-educated scientist who has been published in peer-reviewed journals 67 times, because there's no chance that anybody at CDC could be either Oxford-educated or been published in peer-reviewed journals 67 times, right? There are no good scientists there. A former administration official with direct knowledge of the communications from HHS said a request that all reports be stopped until Alexander could review them in their entirety was rejected, thank God. On other requests, the CDC put its head down and did not comply and continued to get in trouble over and over again for doing so, the former official said. The person spoke on condition of anonymity, of course. MMWRs are written by career experts for scientific and public health specialists and are considered among the most authoritative public health reports because they provide evidence-based information on a wide range of health topics. The reports are independent, scientific publications that undergo rigorous vetting, often with multiple drafts to check data and methodology. The reports are closely held. Few individuals at the CDC have access until just before publication. So anyway, that's kind of what we're looking at in terms of the importance of this publication. A few more snippets from this from this article, that might give us an idea of what's eventually going to happen here with Caputo. Let's see. CDC editorial staff that produces these reports typically send a one-paragraph summary to HHS and other CDC officials just a few days before publication. Whenever they come out with that list, there's a concern across HHS that some of the scholarship has been tainted by politics, Caputo said. That's my opinion, anyway. So how valuable is his opinion in all of this? And is he right? Well, let's see. We'll skip through the rest of this to get to the other fact, and maybe I should check in Pocket Archive for other stories about Caputo, because I know we read them on the air, and if his name doesn't ring a bell for you, it will perhaps remind you, I guess, in my rough summary of what happened with Michael Caputo is he was the one who suffered a very public mental breakdown at the time, right? And a huge health crisis, you'll recall. And I don't know how that worked out or whether it was even true. Quite honestly, I couldn't tell you how much confidence I have in that. But he apparently had a cancer diagnosis. But I think the thing that got more attention was how he had a mental breakdown at the time. There was a USA Today article in the Pocket Archives. HHS spokesperson Michael Caputo diagnosed with cancer after taking medical leave. But the headline over at the New York Times article that we shared at the time hints at what's behind all this. Trump health aide falsely alleges conspiracies and warns of armed revolt. You may recall that Caputo was the guy, in addition to his cancer diagnosis, or claim of a cancer diagnosis anyway, also went out with a Facebook Live, I think, video where in his last hours he was like holed up in his apartment in Washington saying, basically, they're coming to get me. The government assassins are coming. They're going to get us. They're going to overthrow the government. He was having some extraordinary mental health issues. And in other words, belonged in a mental hospital at the time that he was, one, meddling with these MMWRs. And as it turns out, we knew he was a partisan hack and spinning furiously, considered his job spinning for the president in the middle of a pandemic from the middle of HHS. But apparently he also was taking the lead in advocating for this weird mythical drive toward this mythical herd immunity. I grabbed a article on it again from the Twitter machines this morning. Here we go. Over at CNBC. Guess who's behind these headlines? And here's the headline, a quote, right? "We want them infected," Trump HHS appointee said in email, pushing to expose infants, kids, and teens to COVID to reach herd immunity. So, to put it all together, what emails were Redfield and I guess others in the CDC seeking to destroy so that they couldn't be, used as evidence against somebody when all of this came to light, and they were caught in the act, I guess, of pushing to destroy these emails by the folks at Crew. It was these emails from this literal, to use it in the medical sense, which is an outdated terminology here, and people will get upset with us from the mental health and disability community, but literally a lunatic handing out these instructions to everybody and doing their best to destroy America's preeminence in science and medicine so that kids and infants could get sick as soon as possible. I guess I would want to destroy those emails too, but I guess I would also know if I'm in the mental hospital already, the jig is up. But apparently not. And this is what we've got here. Strongly worded letters is our result. Will Feuer, F-E-U-E-R, I hope I'm pronouncing it right. You probably know him. He's probably a well-known figure from CNBC, getting the byline on this one. Key points. Oh, good. Bullet points. Let's go to those. A Trump Health and Human Services Department appointee repeatedly discussed pursuing a so-called herd immunity approach to the COVID-19 outbreak this summer. New emails obtained by a House subcommittee show. Congressman Clyburn at the head of this here, chairman of the select subcommittee on the coronavirus crisis, which obtained the email, said the documents demonstrate a pernicious pattern of political interference. It's not really where my focus is. I mean, it's a huge part of it. Ousted HHS scientific advisor Paul Alexander, who was brought in by longtime Trump ally Michael Caputo, sent the emails around to other HHS officials. Okay, so if he's the one sending them, we don't know if Peter Alexander is in mental health care at the moment, but I guess he belongs there as well. But his work was championed by a guy who went from chief spokesperson at HHS to the mental hospital. Just, by the way. A Trump appointee, all right, well, shall we skip the introduction here? Let's see. Trump appointee, I guess we'll have to use it just to set this up, from HHS repeatedly pushed this summer to adopt a COVID-19 strategy in the U.S. that would keep businesses open while exposing infants, kids, teens, and others to the coronavirus in an attempt to achieve so-called herd immunity, according to emails obtained by House lawmakers. That sounds pretty bad, right? To be able to, to be emailing people in HHS, we want to expose as many children to this as possible. Get them sick ASAP. Get them sick and out there circulating, giving it to other people. So, as I, discussed yesterday with the casualty count here, if you're wondering still at this point in your life how it is that in 9 to 10 months of coronavirus in the United States, we could have lost more Americans to coronavirus in 10 months than we lost in combat in all of World War II. 4 years of World War II. We discussed yesterday the casualty rate in these recent weeks from coronavirus, the death rate 3 to 5 times higher than that of the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, and similarly, by the way, I looked it up to see if was that the most deadly battle of World War II. Okinawa still far outpaced by what we're losing to coronavirus, but they are dying in hospitals behind the walls, and there's no war footage or newsreels to show it all to you. But that's where we are, and if you're wondering how that happened, I don't know, maybe it could be the Trump appointees at HHS and their cronies telling everybody we need to infect as many kids as possible. And nobody was buying that. Nobody was implementing that policy. But they were doing all that they could to make it impossible for the American public to get reliable information about what the F to do about this goddamn pandemic. Whereas in other countries, they were handling it. The one country that couldn't handle it was the one saying maybe we should think about herd immunity, and then immediately backed off of it and denied for the rest of the pandemic that they were ever seeking herd immunity in Sweden. Whereas other countries are back to normal. New Zealand has no coronavirus whatsoever and they haven't had community spread of coronavirus in Australia in 8 months. They showed somebody put together the economic charting on New Zealand. They got the V-shaped recovery that Donald Trump insisted we were going to have in America by staying open. In New Zealand, of course, they shut down hard. And they're right back to where they were economically with GDP numbers and productivity, employment, etc., where they were pre-pandemic. Now, different country, different conditions, yes, but honestly, how did we end up where we end up? We have, what can I tell you, literal mental patients put in charge of the communications. What did Greg tell us was the absolutely most critical part of the public-facing COVID-19 policy heading into the pandemic? The most important thing was how the communications were handled. To put the scientists in charge of it, to be clear and honest and truthful with the American public and tell them what they could be doing to help minimize the spread. And lo and behold, the most incompetent, idiotic president ever hired the most incompetent, sycophantic, and mentally ill people to implement his policies as possible. And we have 25% of all the diagnosed COVID in the world. We have 300,000 dead, more than twice what anybody else in the world, even close to what they have. Their daily totals are 3 times everybody else's. If you were wondering how this happened, and you're wondering how come we're responding with sternly worded letters, well, you're not alone there. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? 1 thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to Patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue on quickly with this CNBC article, just because there's a little bit more. This is the current one about Peter Alexander and his push for herd immunity through Michael Caputo. The emails that surfaced were part of an investigation by the House Coronavirus Subcommittee into alleged political interference by the Trump administration. It happened. The probe came about after former HHS scientific advisor Paul Alexander and longtime Trump ally Mike Caputo were accused this summer of meddling with the work of career scientists at the CDC and Dr. Anthony Fauci, the nation's leading infectious disease specialist. Alexander was ousted when Caputo, Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs, departed HHS on a medical leave in September. So, yeah, I was kind of curious about where would they go with this in the CNBC article. I think that's it. That's the extent of their discussion of what happened with Caputo, which is amazing. HHS Secretary Alex Azar has denied in congressional testimony the allegations of political interference in his department. Alexander wrote in a July 4th email, thanks a lot for your political sensitivity, Canadian guy, doing this on July 4th. Are you trolling us? July 4th email to Caputo and 6 other HHS communications officials that the U.S. needed to establish herd immunity by allowing, quote, non-high-risk groups expose themselves, they probably meant to expose themselves, to the virus. He's definitely writing in shorthand here. You'll see it in the rest of it. Infants, kids, teens, young people, young adults, middle-aged with no conditions, etc., have zero to little risk. So we use them to develop herd immunity, but shorthand for it. We use them to develop herd. We want them infected and recovered with antibodies, he wrote, except a lot of them won't recover. But hey, Alexander later brought the proposed strategy to the FDA. Commissioner Stephen Hahn, another email shows, it may be that it will be best if we open up and flood the zone and let the kids and young folk get infected as we acutely lock down the elderly and at-risk folks to get to, quote, natural immunity, natural exposure, he wrote on July 24th to Hahn, Caputo, and other HHS officials. Caputo asked Alexander to look further into the idea. Further emails show Caputo, who recruited Alexander, left HHS for a 60-day medical leave in September. There is at least some mention of it here, but sort of casual, and I guess they kept it low-key, which I guess is nice for a person who's under mental health treatment. But he left for a 60-day medical leave in September. What day is it now? September, October, November, December. His 60 days are up. What's up with the guy? I don't know. Anyway, why the leave? Well, cancer, yes. But also, as they mentioned here, after he said in a video posted on his personal Facebook page that scientists at the CDC were engaged in, quote, sedition, have you heard that word lately, against Trump. Alexander's departure was disclosed in the announcement of Caputo's medical leave, and that's really the extent of the discussion. I'm going back to the New York Times article in a minute. His emails absolutely did not shape department strategy, and I'm glad for that, an HHS spokesperson said. Dr. Paul Alexander previously served as a temporary senior policy advisor to the Assistant Secretary for Public Affairs and is no longer employed at the department. The new emails present a striking look into Caputo and Alexander's attempts to downplay the pandemic as the coronavirus spread rapidly across the country, especially in the Sun Belt, and the death toll rose. As the virus spread throughout the country, these officials callously wrote, "Who cares?" and "We want them infected," Clyburn said in a statement. They privately admitted they, quote, always knew the president's policies would cause a rise in cases, and they plotted to blame the spread of the virus on career scientists. Interestingly enough, on June 24th, amid the post-Memorial Day surge in cases, Alexander wrote to Caputo and two other HHS officials, quote, "We always knew as you relax and open up, cases will rise." Well, so did I. And then questioned, but are the new cases problematic? 3 question marks on that one. Always a good sign of stability. We need also to tout the good stories, as we know, of elderly with serious conditions who get it and survive. This is key to tell, he added. One guy survived. We should talk about that. Throughout the emails, Alexander heavily criticized top government scientific advisors, including Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. In a July 3rd email, earlier, to Caputo and other HHS communications officials, when U.S. cases stood at just under 2.8 million, Alexander lamented that Fauci warned the public to, quote, expect a dramatic increase in spread. What a nut, right? He just won't stop. And I can't even count accurately the number of exclamation points that follow this. So literally, I would say, I'm going to guess that there are 12 to 15 exclamation points after the word stop. He won't stop. He can't keep quiet. He also uses no apostrophes in his contractions here, but he's not a great writer, this guy. He just won't stop. He can't keep quiet, and he is not on the same page of the GOVN, by which he means government. I don't know if that's a standard abbreviation up there in Canada, but if so, see me after class. They have their own written English up there, but honestly. Anyway, does he think he is the president? 3 question marks, Alexander added. Is he in mental care? I don't know. That might not be our purview here, but Canadians, can you do anything about that? Peter Alexander, check into it, please. And what was it? I can't even remember which university it is, but if you remember, please alert them if they're open. More than 16.7 million people in the U.S. have been diagnosed with COVID-19 so far. We're well over 17 million according to Worldometers. I think we'll be at 17.4 million very shortly, like within a few minutes at this point. Let's see. And more than 306,000 people have died in less than a year, according to data compiled by Johns Hopkins University. They're a couple days slower than the Worldometers people. And that's the end of the article. Jumping back to the New York Times in September 14th, right around the time that Caputo left, Trump health aide pushes bizarre conspiracies and warns of armed revolt. And maybe he wasn't so crazy about that after all, right? We now find ourselves in the middle of that problem. Michael Caputo told a Facebook audience without evidence, that's a favorite phrase over there at the New York Times now, that left-wing hit squads were being trained for insurrection and accused CDC scientists of sedition. That written up at the time by Sharon Lafreniere. And here's the deal, to borrow a phrase from the incoming president. The top communications official at the powerful cabinet department in charge of combating the coronavirus made outlandish and false accusations on Sunday that career government scientists were engaging in sedition in their handling of the pandemic and that left-wing hit squads were preparing for armed insurrection after the election. Well, they got the hit squads preparing for armed insurrection after the election part. Michael Caputo, of course, probably believed that Trump was going to win/cheat / both in the election and that the insurrection would be against his continuance in office. Anyway, what was he up to? He, accused the CDC of harboring a, quote, resistance unit determined to undermine President Trump even if that opposition bolsters the COVID-19 death toll. See, he's already beginning to blame it on them. After emailing back and forth with Peter Alexander, infect as many people as possible as quickly as possible. But it's the scientists' fault. The other one's saying, please don't do this. It won't work. And by the way, I mean, I guess in case I'm sure you've been thinking it along the way, we're at, 314,000 or so dead at the moment in 10 months. We've been discussing how that compares to World War II or particular battles in World War II. I was going to say, what? I can't even remember now. Oh, yes, right. With 300,000+ dead. The United States stands, according again to Worldometers, at about 5.25% of the population infected or, positively diagnosed anyway, testing positive at some point for the coronavirus. That's throughout the pandemic. So they're not necessarily active cases, whatever that might mean. But about 5.25% of the population has gotten it. By most theories that I've heard, and I am not an epidemiologist, but by most theories I've heard, every time it's come up for discussion, people say, well, you're really talking about you got to have something like, and you don't know where, 60 to 80% of the population has to have been infected in order to have the antibodies. They've got to have the antibodies, however they get them, before you're going to get anywhere near what might be deemed herd immunity. And I guess the story is that there's never been we've never reached herd immunity to any disease without a vaccination, of course. It's just never really happened naturally. I guess it's happened in the course of history but prehistory, I suppose. So not in the course of history, but prior to the course of history. So if 300,000 are lost on the way to 5.25% positivity, then, there's probably a number, there's a formula other than, multiply that by whatever it takes to get to 60%, and that's how many people you'll see die. But clearly, the losses would be enormous. And here they are pushing for it, and knowing that the losses would be enormous and unbearable by the American people or indeed the world. Everyone would essentially view this. I have to guess they would eventually see this on the scale of a war crime. Although I do have to say we are still shrugging our shoulders at 300,000 dead, more than the combat losses of World War II, and nobody seems to notice. So I don't know. I mean, maybe this whole story belongs in the "you're never going to get accountability for Trump" file. That's the most depressing thing I could possibly think of to cull from out of this, but it might be the more realistic out of all these things. Certainly more realistic than pursuing this with sternly worded letters. People in the HHS are saying, please give this to as many kids as possible so that everyone gets sick as quickly as possible, and then something, blah, 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 as my kids used to say, 1, 2, 3, magic, magic, it's gone, except 2 to 8 million Americans are also gone. And who knows what happens to the rest of the world, the economy, our ability to recover, our standing in the world, our, who knows what, technological infrastructure, no telling. I mean, all the worst fears of pandemic planners brought to life. And, you know, as I have said many times on Twitter, you know, people will look back at this. It will be very difficult, or certainly if we pursue these policies, it would be very difficult to explain to children of the future why we just said, well, the Constitution says he should just continue in office, and then that he should have bodyguards for the rest of his life after he leaves office, because we're for peaceful transition of power. I mean, pretty much any other country in the world at any other point in history in the world drags their head of government from the presidential palace and tears him to pieces, literally, in front of a screaming crowd. But not here, because American exceptionalism, so that's a good thing. I'm glad we're making that sort of progress. But history will demand to know, how did you not simply give up and hang Trump? And I suppose we'll be very proud of ourselves at that point. I say, boy, our restraint really is something, isn't it? It is remarkable. Everyone should take note of that. But, you know, recent history is still rife with examples of other outcomes. In fact, the vast majority of the world would have seen another outcome, even currently in today's day and age, today's world media spotlight. Still happens. But, you know, one, not here, and two, as other people remind me, our history isn't over quite yet. Anyway, yes, so back to Michael Caputo and his exit from HHS. Caputo, who has faced intense criticism for leading efforts to warp CDC weekly bulletins, we learned back in September, to fit Mr. Trump's pandemic narrative, suggested that he personally could be in danger from opponents of the administration. As you might gather from what I just said, he should have been. He, too, should have been perhaps tossed from a window at some point, and would have been in Putin's Russia, or even if he had escaped Putin's Russia to Zelensky's Kyiv. But whatever. Anyway, so he goes on to say in his Facebook video, if you carry guns, buy ammunitions, ladies and gentlemen. Well, ammunition, ladies and gentlemen, because it's going to be hard to get, he urged his followers. Imagine following this guy. He went further, saying his physical health was in question, and his mental health has definitely failed. At least he knew that. I don't like being alone in Washington, Mr. Caputo said, describing shadows on the ceiling in my apartment. They're alone. Shadows are so long. And I mean, I shouldn't be like, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he's even faking that. I got no idea. Maybe not. But if he's actually, of course, mentally ill, I shouldn't be even, I have this like teasing inflection to it. But I guess that comes from my natural inclination not to believe anything he's saying. But, I mean, we'll put it a different way. If true, he's obviously so sick he doesn't belong in this position. And if that didn't convince you that he was too sick to handle this position, how about his emails saying, let's infect as many children as possible? Let's hurry up and get everyone infected as soon as we can. Would that convince you that he was too sick to take the job? Yeah. Well, who gave him the job? Donald Trump. He was too sick for his job. I can't believe we're not discussing it in these terms. Well, I guess that's what the radio show is for. All right. Well, where else were we here? Right. He's complaining about the shadows and people are coming to assassinate him. He also said the mounting number of COVID-19 deaths was taking a toll on him, telling his viewers, you are not waking up every morning and talking about dead Americans. You're trying to prevent us from doing it. Listen to this guy. He's complaining about, oh my God, it's weighing so heavily on me. I'm trying to infect as many as possible. He's either the most cynical manipulator in the world or is just that sick, or both. That's just what his illness is doing to him, turning him into this kind of truly evil manipulator. And I guess the upshot of it now in hindsight, maybe there was or should have been people on their way to kill you. in your apartment. Might not have been a bad idea. I mean, bad idea for them legally speaking. I don't advise that anybody do it. But I guess if you were doing this and you knew what you were doing, one, it would cause a mental breakdown. And two, it probably would cause you to believe that people were on their way to kill you. Because why aren't they? By rights, they should be. And I know that based on how horrible a person I am and how many people I'm killing and endangering around the world and, and right here at home. So what can I tell you? Maybe he wasn't so crazy after all. But there you have it. I don't know. To me, it's very difficult to know what to do with this. And I guess we fall back on procedure here. And James Clyburn spends his time writing letters about this. And the crew people say, well, what about the preservation of the records? It's true. It has to be there in order to do anything about it. But the likelihood that anything gets done about it. And by the way, let me just throw in another curveball. We mentioned, of course, all the hacking that's been going on. We haven't updated on that story in order to, to keep abreast of it here. We should add a few more new stories, new departments that are being hacked or found to have been hacked along with everything else. I think they probably suspected that the Department of Homeland Security was among them, and in fact it is. But who said this morning? I saw and retweeted somebody's observation this morning that I thought was, I haven't seen it discussed anywhere else, and I have, and I think there's no other evidence to back it up, but it made me say, ooh, wow, that's a thought. Maybe we should pursue that. Yeah, here it is. Tom Matsey, who says, Tom Matsey, I know used to be one of the big muckety mucks over at Move On, like way back in the early days of it. Now CEO of Clean Choice, by the way, and in the clean energy sector. But Tom commenting on this, for those who aren't thinking like the Trump crime family, right? The Russia hack has one big upside for him: spoiled evidence. That's true. I really hadn't given any thought to that. A lot of things I've been seeing people bring up that I said, wow, I didn't even think about that. I'll tell you the other one in a minute. But this one, the idea of, this too, I have had a hard time believing as just like, wow, those Russians, they're just unstoppable. And surely our government is doing everything that they can. It certainly looks for all the world like Trump, basically, whether he invited them in or not, I can't tell you. But he's certainly shrugging his shoulders at this too. My initial guess was that, you remember, I think we talked about this, I reminded you the other day, when I was trying to think of the most egregious thing Trump could do by abandoning his post, whether he won the election or lost it. Quite honestly, I thought these were possible. If he won, he's like, I can't be elected again. I'm no longer accountable to voters ever again in my life, so I'll just do whatever the hell I want. And if he lost, then he's like, well, not only is he not accountable to anybody, but he's probably looking for revenge on his way out the door. What if, as I said, what's the most egregious thing he could do? Well, what if he let the Russians, invade Alaska? You remember that? And then clearly this idea, cyber warfare, shrugging your shoulders at it, is the better, more executable idea, and more easily hidden as well. What would make anybody think that it would be okay with him? Well, I don't know whether, it's hard to tell whether he cares about the American continuity of American government post-Trump. It's hard to know whether he ever cared about the efficient and secure running of American government while he was president. But surely easy enough to imagine why he would shrug his shoulders and walk away from something like this. Not only because, well, Putin wants it and he's beholden to Putin, but a true upside for Trump. If you are looking to hold him accountable and he and his henchmen accountable under a Biden administration or whatever in the future, of course, in order to do it under our famed aegis of law and order, you're going to want all the evidence presented in court, and that evidence exists in federal government records and in emails and et cetera, all the things that Crew is worried that CDC is destroying, interestingly enough. And I feel bad too, in a way. I mean, CDC probably, I don't know why they would have complied with the idea or why they would have pursued the idea of destroying some of the evidence of this, because it looks to me like the evidence could eventually, certainly could be spun as exculpatory for CDC people, but I guess not Redfield himself. But hopefully everybody else is preserving things. But all these other government systems that are being infiltrated, what does that mean for the integrity of the records being kept there? Are those records that the people who would want to cover their tracks by destroying them being destroyed and being destroyed by Russians so that there's no American fingerprints on it and they can't be prosecuted for violations of the Federal Records Act? Is different evidence or exculpatory evidence being planted somehow in all these systems? I really don't know. I got no idea what the Russians are doing in there, and I guess they could be doing any and all of these things. But all that really matters is that defense attorneys will be able to say, yeah, but all this evidence you have against my client, isn't it from a server that was known to have been infiltrated for months or even years by Russian intelligence agents? Yes, I guess it is. And so, are you sure you can speak to the integrity of this evidence? Can it really be admitted in court if everybody knows that it could have been manipulated by foreign intelligence agents for years, planting who knows what in there, or manipulating it in who knows how many ways? And that's kind of all you need when the standard is beyond a reasonable doubt, when you've got people standing criminal trials, standing for criminal trial on these things. So, yes, dangerous thought. I wonder how it plays out. And my fear is that it plays out the same way it always plays out. Everybody's very angry and thinks something ought to happen and feels certain that surely killing hundreds of thousands of Americans would be the thing that you can't escape from. And there's just nothing you can't escape from. So, pardons aside, and we can get to the pardon story at some point. What else did I promise I was going to get to? I knew I would forget it, but anyway, I'll see if it occurs to me again. Let's see. In the meantime, rest of the daily roundup, news bulletin, Emmanuel Macron has coronavirus. So, all right. I think that was probably not unexpected either. France having its own problems with COVID-19. Always on the top 10 list or thereabouts with all the bad indicators. So not terribly surprising. However, Jennifer Jacobs, who I've mentioned to you, is on the undisputed queen of the White House coronavirus beat. Maybe also the champion of what's the French presidential palace? I can't remember anymore. I learned it, but it's French. If it was Spanish, I'd remember it. We talked about it even on the show at some point. One of you knows it. The Elysee. Elysee. There we are, is the answer right here in Jennifer Jacobs' own tweet. Francis Macron has coronavirus. Coronavirus. I don't know how they say it. I'm making fun of you. But not in Canada, where that is illegal. A Trump delegation was near Macron's team in recent days. How about that? Macron had a one-on-one meeting on Monday at the Elysee with U.S. National Security Advisor Robert O'Brien, who had the virus in July. I think the common understanding is that he probably wouldn't be transmitting the virus at this point, but we don't understand this thing. Who knows? Could have been a staffer. Could have been a French person that gave it to him. We can't really say for sure. But I will say I've had my suspicions about what we really know about transmission of the virus and whether or not people who have recovered from it aren't infectious anymore. I mean, I feel like we would have heard some more evidence of this, but I wonder about that. And I wonder about, for instance, how many people spread it around at the Amy Coney Barrett ceremony in the Rose Garden, and especially after we found out that Barrett had it some months prior to. But I think it's all perhaps just coincidence. But write that down and let's get some investigation on that. Let's see. In other coronavirus outrage news, I note that Rachel Maddow noted yesterday, or whoever writes the Rachel Maddow Twitter feed anyway, noting that yesterday was 6 months ago today. She wrote yesterday, that is to say the 6-month anniversary better way of saying it, of Mike Pence's incredibly stupid opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal under the title of "There Isn't a Coronavirus Second Wave." Lots of people, of course, pointing out, well, technically he was right. It was just one huge, tremendous wave, and we never really got to a second wave. Maybe, maybe not. But recall that was 6 months ago yesterday. Where were we, in case you were wondering, at that point? I grabbed the charts from Worldometers about the coronavirus deaths and coronavirus cases back on June 16th when he declared that we were not having a second wave and there wouldn't be one. But just where were we on the charts? As we know, total deaths, we stand in the neighborhood of 314,000. We were at 121,966 on June 16th, just under 122,000. And we're, more than double that since now. And if you look at that point on the chart, the line graph of total deaths on a linear scale, not very impressive prediction. And of course, we were at 2.2 million cases. We're now at 17.2 million cases. And that line graph looks even worse, to be honest. Mike Pence, thankfully, had no serious role in policy making on coronavirus. So he was just talking out of his ass and not bothering anybody, except for the fact that he was chairman of the coronavirus task force at the White House. But other than that, he had nothing to do. All right. We come up on our second break, having ranted, I think, quite effectively for now an hour on the tragedy that is American response to coronavirus and wondering why we're not hanging more people for it. We'll see if we can't move on to other subjects. So I think it's all going to be tinged with coronavirus today, probably. We're just at that juncture. In Biden administration news, lots of names being floated for lots of posts. I guess we'll do it this way on our way out to the break. Don't get too exercised about names being floated just yet. This is a favorite political parlor game in Washington, D.C. Some of it is actually strategic and supposed to get you riled up about one or another of the people. We can discuss all of those things and who's up for what and what the likelihood is that they'll get or take those jobs after this short break. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. On our way out the door for the top of the hour break, I was talking about the idea of new appointments or appointments to the new Biden administration being a favorite DC parlor game. Specifically, I had in mind the question of who would be Attorney General in the Biden administration. Big favorites, names have been mentioned. And I guess at the top of the list, there were, I think, 4 names in contention very recently. But I guess we're sort of seeing it boiled down, at least in the arguments out there, between 2 of them. One being now Senator and outgoing Senator Doug Jones of Alabama, who I think makes an excellent choice for a number of reasons and appears to be the favored of the 2 among progressive circles. The second was Merrick Garland, who seems to be, in my Twitter feed anyway, getting sort of a universal thumbs down type response, and people are getting very exercised about it and, trying to, I guess what's really pushing them to it is who Merrick Garland is and what his name represents. And I think that's why the name has been floated here, too. And in case you can't remember who Merrick Garland actually is or what he's doing these days, all you remember about him is his nomination to the Supreme Court being stymied by Republicans in the Senate during the end of the Biden administration. He is still chief judge on the on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, arguably the second highest court in the country behind the Supreme Court, and a real breeding ground in the best possible sense. Well, sometimes the worst possible sense, like Scalia. But in a very real way, breeding ground for the Supreme Court itself. Lots and lots, not all, not even a majority probably, but an awful lot of Supreme Court justices come through the D.C. Circuit. And there are other very important circuits from which they're often culled as well. Lots, even more important, lots and lots, and here maybe even a majority of Supreme Court clerks move to the Supreme Court through clerking at the D.C. Circuit. It's an extraordinarily influential court. And he's the chief judge there, which I think is part of what drives the rumor mill about him. I mean, it wouldn't be beyond the pale, of course. That's the sort of job that it's generally regarded as such, a top-notch legal job, that a move to Attorney General, for most people, probably you wouldn't bat an eyelash at it, except you should, because quite honestly, and I think probably Merrick Garland himself feels this way, I am not convinced that I would believe, and I'm certainly not convinced that Merrick Garland would believe, or that Joe Biden would believe, that the move from Chief Judge of the D.C. Circuit to Attorney General is actually a promotion. There are very few prestige legal jobs in the government, certainly, that are better than Chief Judge at the D.C. Circuit. One of them, they offered him at one point, and the Senate wouldn't give it to him. That's one. Attorney General, though, no. Not even really a lateral move. A totally different kind of job, to be sure, but I don't even know if I would say it was a lateral move. Of course, it's limited to the service of the president who nominates you, and then, of course, the will of that president to keep you in that job. As we've seen with this president, we have had like 19 attorneys general in the Trump administration. But on the other hand, 4 years of service in that job might be a great career capper for someone like Merrick Garland, who kind of ready to retire anyway. He's not quite at senior status. I think he's about 60. I looked up the other day, maybe 62, 63. And I think around 65 is, I don't even know. There's actual rules about it. You have to move to senior status. And I don't know whether you can stay chief if you're in senior status. So, maybe it's a good idea to take that AG job and kind of go out on the top there rather than being forced out to pasture in senior status. But it is a lifetime appointment, and maybe you want to stay there. I don't know. It just doesn't seem like at this point in his career, like Attorney General is a big prize for him, especially seeing as he is most famous for not making it onto the Supreme Court, not through any fault of his own, but that's how people remember him. On the other hand, that might be exactly why he's being nominated. There are probably people inside the Biden transition team. Maybe not. Maybe it's actually being media driven more than anything else. And the people inside the transition team are getting the idea from media actors that rank and file Democrats would view this as sticking it to the Republicans by making Merrick Garland a top name in the Biden administration legal circles, and there would be nothing, presumably, that Republicans would be able to do about it, especially if, I guess only if, we actually win the two Georgia Senate seats in the runoffs. But leaving that story aside, I'm just curious about whether or not somebody thought that rank and file Democrats would be super excited about, Merrick Garland, I remember. He was the guy that Republicans told us we couldn't have in some important legal job when Obama was president, but now Biden's president, and he made him this really important legal guy. But here he is one and can stay one. And so I'm not certain that that's a real thing. But also there's, a bit of a consolation prize ego boost part of the game to it too. Like, yes, Merrick Garland, we haven't forgotten that you got screwed, and we still think you're an important legal player and would love to have you on board in an administration. And so what we'll do for you here is float your name seriously for Attorney General, but then you'll realize that's not a job you want anyway, but you'll get all the ego boost and good news cycle out of it, and then just stay chief judge and have a good time with that. And we get to say, yes, we still love you over here for reasons because of the debacle of your nomination to the Supreme Court way back when. And then Doug Jones gets it or somebody else gets it. And anyway, I guess I could say don't spend too much time with your, getting yourself wound up about, for instance, whether or not it would be good for the prospects for criminal justice reform if Merrick Garland, who's kind of a hardcore guy on criminal punishment, were to become Attorney General. That's all. All right. Well, let's see. I just thought that was sort of important. And you'll find that this is the case for a lot of nominations. Floating names is a big game in D.C., and it means something to the people here and just riles up everybody else. But the idea is, you boost your stock, essentially, like running for president. Like, okay, everybody is very upset right now. Not everybody, but people are getting themselves riled up about Pete Buttigieg. Apparently, I guess, is the designee for transportation, the transportation department. I've never been terribly exercised about a nominee for transportation before, except, like I said, well, wow, Elaine Chao is going to steal a lot of money, but she'll come in at best, fifth, sixth place in this administration in terms of stealing money. So I guess I can't be too concerned about that. But just transportation isn't my usual issue. So I don't know. But there are other people for whom it's extraordinarily important and they'll be upset about it. And I don't know. I guess they're feeling like maybe they probably feel like, well, the first name they floated was Rahm Emanuel, and I hate him for reasons. And there were good ones, I'm sure. But I can't detail them for you all here. They weren't. I didn't feel exactly the same way, but I have a net negative assessment of Rahm Emanuel probably at this point, so I was sympathetic. And then people even then thought, well, maybe they're just floating Rahm Emanuel, who they know will get a negative reaction, so that they can put in somebody else who would otherwise ordinarily get a mildly negative reaction. But by comparison to Rahm Emanuel, it's a good reaction. And then it turned out to be Pete Buttigieg, and I guess they were really going for that. So anyway, people who have studied Pete Buttigieg's record closely and don't like it have got an argument to make about why he wouldn't make a great transportation secretary. But I don't know if I care that much about it, but that's only because I haven't spent a lot of time reading what their argument is yet. But like I said, a parlor game. In much the same way that running for president as a long shot, like Pete Buttigieg was, is about raising your stock. Same thing with appointments or having your name floated for a cabinet position, even if you think you're not likely to get it. You run for president as the mayor. What was he the mayor? Was it Indianapolis or was it? I can't even remember anymore. South Bend. Gosh, can't recall what he was doing. Who cares? Anyway, long shot candidacy, but even then suspected like, well, what he might really be after is whoever wins the nomination and then they go on to win the general election, then his name will be in contention for cabinet positions, because that's kind of what you do with the rest of the field. And I don't know, sort of a tradition these days. And it works. And so does this other parlor game, is all I'm saying. And so even if you get your name floated and it doesn't work out for you, or sometimes the floating of your name was never necessarily serious. And sometimes it was never even coming from inside the Biden camp at all. It comes from outside. And you're trying to get yourself in contention, either for that job or another one. But you can insert yourself into the discussion for some job for which you are wholly unqualified. But if you're a very popular person, somebody somewhere thinks it's a good idea, and then you don't get the job, you get another one. Deputy undersecretary to something somewhere else or in another department. I just wanted to mention the fact that this game does exist and it has real consequences, and it's a weird, oddball Washington, D.C. thing, but you're not wrong in thinking that it's consequential, but you might be wrong in wasting too much time arguing about it. Okay, let's see, other things I wanted to bring to everyone's attention. I mentioned the hacking, and I saw this article too, and I saw some critique of the article from Marcy Wheeler as well, but let me just take a look at this one. It's an interesting headline, an opinion piece in the New York Times. I was the Homeland Security Advisor to Trump, Thomas Bossert tells us. I already forgot about that. We're being hacked. That much I knew. The magnitude of this national security breach is hard to overstate. So, let's take a look. Let's try to overstate it if we can. At the worst possible time, when the United States is at its most vulnerable, during a presidential transition and a devastating public health crisis, which for some reason Trump wanted to exacerbate, and went ahead and did, I'll add, the networks of the federal government and much of corporate America are compromised by a foreign nation. We need to understand the scale and significance of what is happening. Last week, the cybersecurity firm FireEye said that it had been hacked and that its clients, which include the United States government, had been placed at risk. This week, we learned that SolarWinds, a publicly traded company that provides software to tens of thousands of government and corporate customers, was also hacked. The attackers gained access to SolarWinds software before updates of that software were made available to its customers. Unsuspecting customers then downloaded a corrupted version of the software, which included a hidden backdoor that gave hackers access to the victim's network. This is what's called a supply chain attack, meaning the pathway into the target networks relies on access to a supplier. Supply chain attacks require significant resources and sometimes years to execute. They are almost always the product of a nation state. Maybe. I don't know. He says so. Evidence in the SolarWinds attack points to the Russian intelligence agency known as the SVR, whose tradecraft is among the most advanced in the world. According to SolarWinds SEC filings, the malware was on the software from March to June. The number of organizations that downloaded the corrupt update could be as many as 18,000, which include most federal government unclassified networks, and more than 425 Fortune 500 companies. The magnitude of this ongoing hack is hard to overstate. The Russians have had access to a considerable number of important and sensitive networks for 6 to 9 months. The Russian SVR will surely have used its access to further exploit and gain administrative control over the networks it considered priority targets. For those targets, the hackers will have long ago moved past their entry point, covered their tracks, and gained what experts call persistent access, meaning the ability to infiltrate and control networks in a way that is hard to detect or remove. While the Russians did not have the time to gain complete control over every network they hacked, they most certainly did gain it over hundreds of them. It will take years to know for certain which networks the Russians control and which ones they just occupy. The logical conclusion is that we must act as if the Russian government has control of all the networks it has penetrated. But it is unclear what the Russians intend to do next. The access the Russians now enjoy could be used for far more than simply spying. And I guess that's the part that worries us. By the way, the logical conclusion is that we must act as if Donald Trump invited the Russians to occupy all of these networks. But I gather that we're not reaching that conclusion in this opinion piece because he was at least at one point a Trumper. The actual and perceived control of so many important networks could easily be used to undermine public and consumer trust in data, written communications, and services. In the networks that Russians control, they have the power to destroy or alter data or, say, evidence of the president's criminality or that of his cronies, and to impersonate legitimate people. Domestic and geopolitical tensions could escalate quite easily if they use their access for malign influence and misinformation, both hallmarks of Russian behavior. What should be done? On December 13th, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, a division of the Department of Homeland Security, itself a victim in these hacks, issued an emergency directive ordering federal civilian agencies to remove SolarWinds software from their networks. And reminder, they were able, in fact, to get this directive out, despite the fact that in the middle, as it turns out, or the end, or anyway, of all of this hacking, Trump fired the head of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, Christopher Krebs. Why? Because Krebs said, we managed to prevent any major outside infiltration and interference in our elections, which is something Trump needed people to believe had happened in order to believe that he had actually won, et cetera, et cetera. So in his vainglorious drive to gaslight the entire world into believing that he had been elected to a second term, he coincidentally dismantled the leadership of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency just at the point at which I guess it was finally discovering that all the government had been hacked by the Russians. And maybe he was firing him to try to prevent him from finding that out and weeding his friend Vladimir Putin out of those networks. But and maybe it's easier to believe that that's what he was doing because he would now have failed at that. And that seems to be kind of a Trump hallmark, too. Who knows? Anyway, let's see, the removal, I guess, of the software, SolarWinds software from all the networks is aimed at stopping the bleeding. Unfortunately, the move is sadly inefficient and woefully too late. The damage is already done and the computer networks are already compromised. It's also impractical. In 2017, the federal government was ordered to remove from its networks software from a Russian company, Kaspersky Lab, that was deemed too risky. And guess what? It took over a year to get it off the networks. Even if we double that pace with SolarWinds software, and even if it wasn't already too late, the situation would remain dire for a long time. The remediation effort alone will be staggering. It will require the segregated replacement of entire enclaves of computers, network hardware, and servers across vast federal and corporate networks. Somehow the nation's sensitive networks have to remain operational despite unknown levels of Russian access and control. A do-over is mandatory, and entire new networks need to be built and isolated from compromised networks. I would gather that that'll end up being virtually impossible. Cyber threat hunters that are stealthier than the Russians must be unleashed on these networks to look for the hidden, persistent access controls. The information security professionals actively search for, isolate, and remove advanced malicious code that evades automated safeguards. This will be difficult work, as the Russians will be watching every move on the inside. National Defense Authorization Act, you remember that we had that fight over it and Trump was going to veto it, which each year provides the Defense Department and other agencies the authority to perform its work, is caught up in partisan wrangling. And weirdly, Vladimir Putin's favorite lackey is saying, I'm going to veto the thing in the middle of the transition and leave the people who need funding for this work hanging out to dry. Why would he do that? He's not working for the American government. He's working for the Russian government. Yes, he's the president of the United States, allegedly, but what can you do? He just serves a different master. Oh, well, that's our constitutional design. Among other important provisions, the act would authorize the Department of Homeland Security to perform network hunting in federal networks. If it wasn't already, it is now a must-sign piece of legislation, and it will not be the last congressional action needed before this is resolved. Network operators also must take immediate steps to more carefully inspect their internet traffic to detect and neutralize unexplained anomalies and obvious remote commands from hackers before the traffic enters or leaves their networks. The response must be broader than patching networks. While all indicators point to the Russian government, the United States and ideally its allies must publicly and formally attribute responsibility for these attacks. If it is Russia, President Trump, must make it clear to Vladimir Putin that these actions are unacceptable. Sure, over a beautiful chocolate cake. I'm sure he can do it. The U.S. military and intelligence community must be placed on increased alert. All elements of national power must be placed on the table. While we must preserve our right to unilateral self-defense, allies must be rallied to the cause. The importance of coalitions will be especially important to punishing Russia and navigating this crisis without uncontrolled escalation. Unfortunately, Trump has destroyed all of those coalitions and trashed them at their core as well, and as well as disparaged all the member nations to those coalitions. So I'm sure that'll work out just great. President Trump is on the verge of leaving behind a federal government and perhaps a large number of major industries compromised by the Russian government. Mission accomplished. He must use whatever leverage he can muster, none, to protect the United States, which is not in his interest, and severely punish the Russians, which also isn't in the cards. President-elect Joe Biden must begin his planning to take charge of this crisis. We always have to clean up the mess of prior Republican administrations. He has to assume that communications about this matter are being read by Russia and assume that any government data or email could be falsified, which is also what the Trump defense lawyers will be pleading in court if we ever even try to hold the Trump administration accountable for its crimes. At this moment, the two teams must find a way to cooperate. That ain't happening either. President Trump must get past his grievances about the election and govern for the remainder of his term. He hasn't yet, but I'm sure he will in the next 2 weeks. This moment requires unity, purpose, and discipline. Oh well. An intrusion so brazen and of this size and scope cannot be tolerated by any sovereign nation. We are sick, distracted, and now under cyber attack. Leadership is essential. It's all beautifully put, Thomas Bossert, but this is on you too. You signed up for this, idiot, and now we're dying. And it's largely your fault. Might as well just say so. Let's see. In fact, somebody else has said so. Where did I put this one? I know there was a thread on this. Yes, Simon Rosenberg. Just, I thought, put it rather succinctly the other day. Responding to a tweet from Chris Bing, a Reuters cyber reporter, reporting on all the hacking, saying that this incident comes shortly after Trump administration fired the heads of DHS's Cybersecurity Infrastructure Protection Agency, of course, as we just mentioned, Krebs. There is also no current top cyber official in his place. Multiple agencies wrapped up their investigation. Keep an eye on the story. They're updating the story over at Reuters. This was about 4 days ago when this thing was first breaking. But I thought Simon Rosenberg put it succinctly, as I said. Trump put doltish partisans at virtually every critical point in our system, that the system which normally would prevent this kind of historic breach. But again, repeating myself here, Trump put doltish partisans at virtually every critical point in our system. ODNI, Office of the Director of National Intelligence, right? Where we ended up with Ratcliffe, even though we knew that he was faking his resume. Was that his name? Yeah, he's still there. The National Security Advisors, we could add to that, multiple national security advisors, starting with the notorious and already known international spy Mike Flynn, who he's, of course, pardoned since then. Top DHS officials, it's in at Homeland Security, right? And dismantled the CISA. I don't know if I know that offhand. Is that the Cyber Intelligence Security Agency? Dismantled their leadership. Massive fail by Trump and his team, except as many people chimed in to comment, it's not a massive fail if that was the design of the program, but maybe, being tongue-in-cheek about it doesn't really help all that much at this point. Okay. Other news. Just try and round up a couple more stories. Maybe you can fit this one in before our next break. Another of the many stories that Patrick Snyder has pointed me to in the last couple of days with a, wait, what? Comment here. This is kind of interesting. News from the Daily Beast. New, says their tweet about it, the longtime aide to Putin's congressman. Remember Dana Rohrabacher? Remember when McCarthy diverted everyone's attention from Ukraine by saying there's two people I think Putin pays, Trump and Rohrabacher, right? Swear to God. Well, Rohrabacher news here. Top longtime aide to Putin's congressman Dana Rohrabacher died suddenly from a head injury over the weekend. Weird, right? Paul Behrens was found by emergency responders close to his home, but not in it, close to his home, on Friday night with severe head trauma. Just out of the blue. He can't fall out of a window in Kyiv. Something can fall out of a window in California and fall on your head. That's the news from the Daily Beast. Let's see. They run it under this headline, which is equally interesting. I want to squeeze this one in before our break, too. Ex-Hill staffer linked to Veselnitskaya. Remember her? The one who was at the Trump Tower June 2016 meeting to discuss alleged issues of Russian adoption, which was code word for please don't enforce the sanctions against us, lift the sanctions against us in exchange for our cooperation with your election. Ex-Hill staffer linked to Veselnitskaya dies suddenly after fall near his home. So a fall was involved. Paul Behrens, who lost his job on the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee after links to Russia were reported, suffered a head injury close to his home on Friday night. We won't get a chance to read all the way through this piece, certainly before the break, and besides which it looks to be a firewalled story anyway. That doesn't mean we can't read it, but we'll have to do some jumping around here in order to get it to work. All right, well, one of those things will have to be pocketing it first and then reading the pocket version. Okay, we're a couple seconds behind on the music here. We'll see whether during the break we can set it up for actual reading, because it is kind of interesting. We'll at least take some of it and throw that out there for your consideration. And who knows where the last segment of today's show will take us. We'll find out soon enough. About 2 minutes from now is what my prediction is. But anything can happen in this day and age. We might be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com, and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see. Okay, one, I want to get to that Daily Beast thing, but first let me at least bring this to your attention, because why not? Sounds fun. Don Winslow. Who's Don Winslow? Let's take a look. Don Winslow, a checkmarked type of fellow, is, let's see, the #1 internationally best-selling author of The Cartel, and also The Force, and The Border, and Savages, and I'm not up to speed on all of that, so maybe you've read those things and you're like, well, of course, Don Winslow. I don't know, but I can take his word for this one, I guess. CNN headline just now, which I guess he means by headline Chiron, perhaps. It just must have come across the screen. I don't know, no screenshot or anything. But Don Winslow says it. He says that on CNN, it says, quote, Trump has told some advisors he will refuse to leave White House, unquote. So that seems cool. I don't know whether there's any tear gas left that they could possibly use to drum him out, but, what are you going to do at this point? Who knows whether anybody actually heard him say that or not. It's just, at this point, throw it on the fire. And we'll think about it later. Okay. Just wanted to let you know that this was happening. Let's take a look behind the firewall here at the story of Paul Behrens and what happened to him. The longtime aide to Putin's congressman, Dana Rohrabacher, died suddenly from a head injury over the weekend. Paul Behrens was found by emergency responders close to his home on Friday night with severe head trauma. He was taken to a local hospital where surgeons fought to save him, but he passed away on Saturday, according to a spokesman for Rohrabacher. Behrens was a controversial figure on Capitol Hill, who lost his job as staff director for the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee after the Daily Beast reported on his links to Trump Tower lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya and her operation in the U.S. Seems proper. Rohrabacher's former congressional spokesman, Ken Grubbs, is he still getting paid for anything? Why bother in telling the Daily Beast this? But he told him that Behrens died at the hospital. I did actually call Dana, and he confirmed it. He said, what I've heard is that he slipped and hit his head and died in surgery. Okay. Grubbs said there was no reason to think anything suspicious had happened to Behrens or that there was any link to his associations with Russia. No, not at all, he said. Behrens' son, Joseph Behrens, Josef, in case you're interested in reading something into that, Joseph Behrens told the Daily Beast that no one had seen his father fall at around 10 p.m. on Friday night, but that his older brother, also called Paul, had rushed to the scene just 4 blocks from the family home when police came to the house. He was walking through the neighborhood, and then he went to the hospital from there, he said. And then he passed away on Saturday, early morning. Behrens made headlines for the first time in July of 2017 after Veselnitskaya's explosive June 2016 Trump Tower meeting with Jared Kushner, Donald Trump Jr., and then Trump campaign chairman Paul Manafort, who went to prison. And did he get his pardon? No, he got his release, right, under coronavirus protocols, and I guess he'll get his pardon later on if he hasn't had it already. Well, after all of that was exposed, let's see, the meeting subsequently shone a light on Behrens' own Russian entanglements. Behrens had traveled to Moscow with Rohrabacher in April of 2016, a few months before that meeting. In Russia, they were given a document from the Prosecutor General's office marked confidential, which included details of the Kremlin's battle against U.S. sanctions and a pro-Kremlin propaganda movie. Hey, for the flight home. When they returned to D.C., Rohrabacher cited those Kremlin talking points as he delayed the passage of the Global Magnitsky Act. Behrens then worked alongside Veselnitskaya and Rinat Akhmetshin, a Soviet Army veteran who accompanied Veselnitskaya to the notorious Trump Tower meeting, to help deliver some of the suggestions made in Moscow. Veselnitskaya was later indicted by the U.S. for allegedly colluding with Russian officials to obstruct justice in an American court case. They worked together to organize a subcommittee hearing that would call the director of the propaganda movie, as well as other witnesses who were sympathetic to President Putin. The hearing, which was set to re-examine U.S. sanctions against Russia, was eventually quashed and replaced by a full committee hearing on Russia. Rohrabacher still succeeded in approvingly comparing President Trump to Putin and submitting testimony that claimed Russia was not behind the assassination of Alexander Litvinenko, the former FSB agent who was poisoned with a radioactive isotope in London. After the hearing, Behrens, Rohrabacher, Akhmetshin, and Veselnitskaya had dinner at the Capitol Hill Club, a private members club frequented by Republicans. Time out. The Capitol Hill Club is the actual Republican Party, I wouldn't say Republican Party headquarters, but it is in the Republican Party headquarters. But it's the restaurant that the Republican Party HQ. I mean, that's the National Republican Club. There is a National Democratic Club, and in the DNC building headquarters, they have a bar and grill room and everything. It's very weird and clubby and old-timey and all. But the Capitol Hill Club is the Republican National Committee headquarters, essentially. And to just say it's a private members club frequented by Republicans. I mean, a strip club is a private member club frequented by Republicans. This is just the Republican National Headquarters. Dana Rohrabacher, Paul Behrens, and Rinat Akhmetshin and Natalia Veselnitskaya ate dinner in the restaurant in the Republican National Headquarters. That's insane. And to not say so is not good. I mean, have you not passed it? I mean, it's right there. It's literally maybe a couple hundred feet from the entrance from the Longworth House office building. It's right there. If you've ever taken the metro in Washington, D.C., I got a lot of listeners in the Washington, D.C. area. Well, you would know, obviously. If you ever come out the Capital South Metro, out the escalator, right, and you're probably going to Congress or one of the office buildings, and you're just going to walk straight ahead. But if you look to your right when you come up to the top of the escalator, the white brick building across the street that's got a little canopy, out the door, old-timey style, to like where the limos would pull up. That's it. It's right there. You could probably, not everybody could, but you could probably throw rocks in between there and break windows in the, you'd have to kind of have a cannon to break windows in the Longworth House office building from the steps of the Capitol Hill Club. But it could be done. Baseball teams, they could do it. In case you're planning something like that, bring a baseball player with you. Anyway, it was the next day that Kevin McCarthy, who was House Majority Leader at the time, was recorded, and he is now too. He's Minority Leader, of course, at the moment. Sorry. House Majority Leader at the time was recorded at the GOP meeting saying, "There's two people I think Putin pays, Rohrabacher and Trump." I got it reversed. When colleagues laughed, he was heard on tape saying, "Swear to God." And once again, one of my pet peeves is everybody thinks of that the tape is about McCarthy admitting that he thinks Putin pays Trump. The whole conversation still burns me up to this day, was about Ukraine. They had just received a visit from the then new Ukrainian prime minister, who came to tell them how pervasive Russian interference in their politics and in the politics of all Western nations was, and how likely it was to get in the United States as well, and that they really needed some help in pushing back against the Russians and standing strong against their manipulation and later invasion. And McCarthy basically sold them out and made the whole thing about a joke, an alleged joke about Putin and Trump, and we all fell for it too. It's all pretty amazing, and should have been brought up more prominently in and around the impeachment trial of Donald Trump over the Ukraine issue. I mean, the fact that Republicans were, of course, coming to the defense of the Republican president should have surprised no one, but it might have had some value to say, by the way, they've been running interference for Trump over Ukraine for years, right from the beginning, even before he won the nomination. He was caught dead to rights, and we learned very clearly from the Ukrainians what the Russians were likely to do, not only in the United States, but in the United States through the use of and manipulation of Ukraine itself. And lo and behold, it came to pass, and you all missed it. How odd. Anyway, back to the Daily Beast thing about Paul Barron's here. A day after these events were recounted in articles at the Daily Beast and the Atlantic, the conversations, and I guess the dinner as well, a spokesman for the House Foreign Affairs Committee said Paul Barron's no longer works at the committee. After being ousted from the subcommittee role, Barron's continued to work closely with Rohrabacher, who was later defeated in the 2018 midterms. Barron's, whose political career began as an intern for Rohrabacher in the 90s, was most recently a partner at Rohrabacher's lobbying firm R&B Strategies. Ooh, R&B, isn't that cute? Rohrabacher and Barron's, actually, not rhythm and blues here. But now he's dead, and I don't know what happens to his share in the lobbying firm, or whether anybody has any interest in that. Okay, that sounds pretty interesting. Let's see. All right, well, catching up on a couple other items. Let's see, I want to jump around a little bit too. Gosh, there's an awful lot here. Oh yes, speaking of McCarthy, I guess we can throw this in here. I noticed Jake Tapper tweeting this morning. McCarthy flapping his gums about, did we get into this? I think we did, right? We talked about yes, I'm sure we did, about what was happening in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, where Marionette, believe it or not, that was her name, Marionette Miller Meeks, was declared the winner by some extraordinarily, 6-vote margin? 6 votes. But where Democrats in the House might be considering entertaining the challenge to her election brought by her rival, her Democratic opponent, Rita Hart. I don't want to read too much of the attached piece to Kevin McCarthy's tweet because it comes from the Washington Examiner, but Iowa voters, it says here, would view Hart as an illegitimate congresswoman if installed by the House. And we talked about how that could actually happen, though I don't know what the likelihood of it happening actually is. But Kevin McCarthy tweeting about this, if Nancy Pelosi, trying to preemptively rally against it, if Nancy Pelosi tries to overturn the people's vote in Iowa's 2nd Congressional District, the losing Democrat candidate will be viewed as illegitimate. Republican Marionette Miller Meeks won, and I look forward to her swearing in on January 3rd. Remind anybody of another situation currently looming? It certainly reminded Jake Tapper, in case you're not getting it, but I think you did. Jake Tapper commenting appropriately here. Amazing. McCarthy literally signed on to a brief that would have disenfranchised tens of millions of voters in Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. A brief called Garbage and Insanity by conservative legal experts. A brief based on lies and conspiracy theories. But now this. Yes, if they were to overturn the will of the voters in Iowa's 2nd District, illegitimate. What a tragedy. Except this one actually has some basis. And when you're talking about 6 votes, hey, who knows? Anyway, just sort of interesting and definitely needed to be part of the general news roundup of the day. A couple other things on the coronavirus front. I guess without Greg here, we didn't get to this at the top of the show, which is probably where he would have brought it up. And it's also seasonally appropriate in this sense. Let me read you the Politico, at least headline on the article. You've likely seen this one. FDA says the Pfizer vaccine vials hold extra doses, which unexpectedly has expanded our initial supply of this stuff. As it turns out, it says in the subheader here, using every drop from overfilled vials could boost available doses by up to 40%. As I understand it, long story short here, the vials were supposed to contain 5 doses each of the coronavirus vaccine, but they've been overfilled, and you can squeeze a 6th full dose out of it. In some cases, they've been so overfilled, apparently, you can squeeze even a 7th dose out of the same vial, which would be terrific. Let's see. If you had 5 and you can get 2 more, 2/5 is what, 40% more? So that's nice. You can vaccinate 40% more people on the limited dosage you thought you were getting. Although I did see that late last night, it sounded like the federal government was scaling back even further on the amount of vaccine that was scheduled to be shipped to certain states. And I wondered whether that was taking into account the possibility that you might be able to squeeze between 20 and 40% more doses out of the initial shipment, or whether they were just being pricks. But I don't know which it is. It could be both. Anyway, that's the news about the Pfizer vaccine. I think we've pretty effectively, long story shorted that one. The only other comment I would add to that is somebody was very clever, making it seasonally appropriate. It was credit where credit is due here. Ariel Edwards-Levy, senior reporter and polling editor at the Huffington Post, saying, but to their surprise, the vial lasted for 6 doses, is the most 2020 update of the Hanukkah story imaginable. Pretty good. Well worth passing that one on. And, rare bit of good news in all of this. It seems it's weird that they aren't filled by some sort of precision equipment. It almost feels like Pfizer was intending to do that somehow. That we heard that the Trump administration might manipulate the number of doses that they're shipping to everybody. So maybe we can secretly tell the government we're sending 100 doses, but really send anywhere between 120 and 140 with every batch or whatever, and really help people out. I don't know whether it's standard practice or a mistake or what, but it's good news and we'll take it. Dumb news. How about some dumb news? Why not? We'll take a look at the original here. Andrew Solinder tweeting this one out, a Forbes reporter who notes this item from the office of the press secretary at the White House arriving in his inbox. President Trump is nominating Rudy Giuliani's son, Andrew Giuliani, to serve on, what's the next natural step for the guy who was in charge of inviting sports teams to the White House when they won championships, but now nobody can go because coronavirus, and you were going to poison us with fast food, right? His new job, serving on the United States Holocaust Memorial Council. Of course. Why not? Where else would a Giuliani belong, after all? And I was reminded yesterday by our friend Dana Hool, who retweeted, I guess, one of Giuliani's many attacks against George Soros, himself a Holocaust survivor, as I recall, in his many attacks, and I guess defending himself against having been, found attacking a Holocaust survivor. Well, what did he say? I'm more of a Jew than George Soros did. Well, I guess his son is even more of a Jew than he is, and it belongs on the Holocaust Memorial Council, which I saw some people researching. People are wondering about all these last-minute appointments, whether any of them are paid assignments. Somebody I saw in the comments to this claiming that, in fact, this one was. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. But it did raise a question. Like, I mean, Andrew Giuliani, I don't know. He's I'm sure, incompetent to the task, but incompetence is the least of our concerns. I'm wondering, what do you do? I mean, sometimes some of these positions are for a term of years, and it's very difficult under ordinary circumstances legally to dislodge someone from there. And I'm not guessing that Giuliani is going to do anything horrific in that position, so maybe just as well to leave him there. But what if Trump could certainly be convinced that he could own the libs somehow. Why not? What if he were to, appoint one of the staunch neo-Nazis who support him to the Holocaust Memorial Council, just to make trouble and make people angry and upset? What legal mechanisms exist to dislodge somebody from something like that? I'm curious. Maybe just good behavior clauses somewhere. I don't know whether they even exist for jobs like that are so far down the ladder, but it just made me wonder. Yes, I mentioned earlier that there was news and reporting about the mad scramble for pardons from the outgoing Trump administration. CNN did report on that subject, giving bylines here to Pamela Brown, Kevin Liptak, and Jeremy Diamond. Headline: It's turned crazy. It's turned crazy. Is that right? Inside the scramble for Trump pardons, President Donald Trump may not be willing to accept that his term is ending, but as the clock ticks down on his time in office, hundreds of his allies, including some of his closest, his closest business associates and many high-profile criminals, that is some Venn diagram there, are ramping up their efforts to squeeze out the final ounces of his presidential power. Since Trump lost the election 6 weeks ago, calls and emails have been flooding into the West Wing from people looking to benefit from the president's powers of clemency. So inundated is Trump's staff with requests for pardons or commutations that a spreadsheet has been created to keep track of the requests directed to Trump's close aides. That doesn't really sound all that extreme to me, but okay. Trump, who refuses to acknowledge his loss and who officials say is devolving further into denial, has nonetheless been eager to engage on who is requesting what. He's been handed case summaries to review. Those are going right in the garbage. In some instances, he has polled his network of associates about whom he should pardon. That's the extent of the work. It gets him on the phone talking to friends. Do you think I should pardon this guy? What about this guy? With the end, this to him is like choosing patterns and colors for drapes and things. He loves decorating, and this is a unilateral power, and it doesn't require much thought, and there's not much room for people to question him or push back. So this is personal favors he can dole out, and he loves doing this. With the end of his presidency nearing, Trump appears eager to wield his powers before he finds them gone, unlike practically any other matter related to the end of his presidency, or indeed the actual presidency itself. His clemency powers are a topic Trump seems to actually enjoy discussing. One person in communication with the president said, even though it amounts to another tacit reminder that his tenure at the White House is nearly over. That's a stark contrast with how Trump has responded to another smaller effort, also ramping up as Inauguration Day approaches, an effort to convince Trump to accept the election results. The Electoral College's affirmation of President-elect Joe Biden's win this week did not appear enough to shake Trump from his delusions of victory, but it is adding urgency to a push by several of his advisors to gently steer Trump toward reality. Maybe. Several of his closest allies have urged him to move on from his efforts to contest the election and begin planning his post-White House political future, including that potential 2024 run. Yet, even amid the intractable movement of the transition and the hurried lame duck activity, some of which he is participating in himself, Trump is steadfastly refusing to acknowledge that he lost. In his moments of deepest denial, Trump has told some advisors that he will refuse to leave the White House on Inauguration Day. So there you go, some confirmation of the CNN chyron spotted earlier. Only to be walked down from that ledge. It's really talked down, but the possibility has alarmed some aides, but few believe Trump will actually follow through. He's throwing a effing temper tantrum, an advisor said. He's going to leave. He's just lashing out, which is totally healthy and cool. The White House declined to comment for this report. On Tuesday, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell acknowledged Biden as the president-elect for the first time and commenced an effort to prevent Republicans from waging a last-ditch effort to overturn the will of the voters, even as Trump encourages that effort and shuts down any talk of leaving the White House. Overnight, Trump lashed out at McConnell. "People are angry," he tweeted, linking to an article about his allies criticizing the Republican leader for his move. Yet, even amid his delusions, Trump is behaving like a president in winter, abandoning the principal responsibilities of his job as he looks for ways to reward loyalists while he still can. Now back to the pardon part of the story, although that was just as interesting as any of it. Nowhere is the end of Trump's term more obvious than in the push for pardons. Right, again, it's turned crazy. One person familiar with the effort said, "There's a lot of activity." Because Trump has shown little interest in using the Justice Department's pardon attorney system for assessing requests for executive clemency, petitioners are approaching the White House directly, calling or emailing Senior Advisor Jared Kushner, Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, or White House Counsel Pat Cipollone when they can't get a hold of Trump himself. Everyone assumed there's no formal process and they should just reach out to the administration directly, the person said, and that's because they've abandoned the formal process. Everyone hopes they have a friend of a friend of a friend of a cousin who they hope will get them to read the email. If there is a governing principle in who appears most likely to secure clemency, it is someone the president either knows personally, which is totally wrong, but whatever, or who has powerful connections lobbying on their behalf. At least one person working on behalf of clients seeking pardons said they hoped their loyalty to Trump over the past 4 years would pay off now. As it happens, Trump is mulling the pardons at a juncture when loyalty appears his principal concern, complaining repeatedly over the past few weeks that Republicans are deserting him when he needed them to help overturn the election results. This is all going to play very prominently in his mind. But P.S., by the way, if you think you've been loyal to Trump, recall that, what's his name? Bailey, the guy from the White House Security Office, claimed to be a Trump loyalist all the way through, and Trump let him languish in the hospital with COVID while he got the miracle Regeneron cure. This guy got his leg amputated. He keeps using that word loyalty. I do not think it means what you think it means. It certainly doesn't mean to you what Trump thinks it means. Anyway, as it happens, right, he's mulling all of this at a time when he thinks everybody has double-crossed him anyway, which is always the case. He has largely frozen out those advisors and associates who do not seem on the same page with the election cheating. One person who used to speak to Trump regularly but who delicately encouraged him to soften his post-election stance no longer has his calls returned and hasn't heard from Trump in weeks. In all, the president is considering pardons for more than 24 people in his orbit whom he believes were targeted or could be targeted in the future for political ends. Well, everything's for political ends, I'm sure, in his mind, but in other words, he has a crime family and he needs to protect them, including his real family, who are also part of his crime family. That's in addition to hundreds of requests from others who have approached the White House directly and tens of thousands more whose petitions are pending at the Justice Department. Those people, if you're going through the Justice Department, I think you're sunk. This week, Alice Johnson and Duke Tanner, whose prison sentences Trump commuted earlier in his term, were at the White House to petition for additional acts of clemency, according to a tweet from Tanner. Johnson's communications in 2018 came after personal lobbying from Kim Kardashian West. Yet this week, a similar effort by Kardashian West to secure clemency for a federal death row inmate, Brandon Bernard, was unsuccessful. He was, of course, executed shortly after. Instead, Trump has focused more on those within his own circle, including Michael Flynn, another name among consideration, Alan Weisselberg, the chief financial officer of the Trump Organization, who has come under scrutiny by investigators for his role in the hush money payments. Who could possibly have guessed this? As of this week, officials said a preemptive pardon for Trump himself has not been ruled out. Time now for us to really wind things up, but let's see what else we can squeeze out of this. Efforts to convince Trump to accept his loss have run up against the president who seems to be increasingly entrenched in his denial of Biden's win, egged on by his advisors like Rudy Giuliani and Jenna Ellis, who are misleading Trump about the extent of voting irregularities and the prospects of a reversal. While Trump had begun to privately accept the reality that he lost the election late last month, advisors say Trump has now reversed and dug in deeper, not only spreading misinformation about the election, but ingesting it himself. He's been fed so much misinformation that I think he actually thinks this thing was stolen from him, a Trump advisor said of the president. I can't finish the whole article at this point, but you get the idea. Certainly worth a look. Time now, of course, to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy coming up next. One of the other things I had hoped to squeeze in, we still have tomorrow, but think Jenna Ellis, since her name came up in the closing minutes here. We've got more information on just, what a fraud from out of left field she really is. Anyway, let's see what Justice has coming up on the program next, provided that everything is working on his end. Of course, the storm was on the East Coast. He's from the West Coast, but hey, you never know. Let's see what's going on here. We'll begin with the reason Rand Paul claimed, without any evidence, that in many ways the election was stolen is because when they lose, it's always stolen from them. And also, of course, stolen is seamlessly appropriate as well. A delicious baked treat from the Germanic Christmas tradition. But I don't think that's what he was talking about. Anyway, we'll be right back.
From netrootsradio.com, you have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
And I meant right back just for this quick announcement. What else has he got on tap? The family behind OxyContin maker Purdue Pharma is scheduled to face congressional scrutiny today. And Tyson Foods has fired 7 top managers. You know why? Laying wagers on how many workers would test positive for coronavirus. Finally got around to punishing someone for that one. Next.